Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm Scotty West. Well, this is it, folks. Lesson 32. You pretty much know it all in terms of the language of music and how it relates to the guitar in popular music. Today, we're going to do a general review of the entire program and take a little look at what ear training is all about. You'll want to have all your support material handy as we go through this review. So, all set? Here we go. Hi, welcome back. Before we go into this review, I wanted to just mention a couple of more things about modulation and substitution, which we were talking about last week. These are huge subjects which we're really only able to scratch the surface on. We kind of ran out of time on the subject of substitution. I'll tell you just a couple more facts about that in a moment. But one important thing that I didn't get to mention last week, I don't think, that I wanted to talk about today was, remember, on the subject of modulation here, we know everything about how conventional chord progressions work, but what we learned last time is that not all music stays in the same key all the way through the song. Modulating music is music that changes key. And we talked about some of the specifics of that. I don't think I'm going to take any more time to actually talk about that today, but there's one thing I wanted to remind you of, and I'll remind you of this again when we're going through our review today. But remember back when we were talking about scales and the relationship between scales and chords, we talked about all our diatonic modes and our diatonic harmony relationships between the chord progression and the scales that you use to create melodies over them. Remember that whole subject of the modes of melodic minor? Remember, the major diatonic scale is not the only scale that has modes. Pentatonic scales have modes. Any scale can have modes, can it? One of the big ones that we looked at sort of briefly was the modes of melodic minor. Those were scales like Lydian flat 7, Lydian sharp 5, the altered scale, Locrian natural 9, Dorian flat 9. These were the modes of melodic minor, and we said at the time that later on we would tell you when to use those. They don't show up in strict diatonic music, do they? Where do they show up? Well, many times those modes of melodic minor are the scales you're going to find yourself playing when you are playing in pieces of music that modulate. As we said, they don't show up in strict diatonic music, but in modulating chord progressions, particularly the scales Mixolydian flat 13 and Lydian flat 7. Both of these are scales that are going to show up in modulating chord progressions quite often. Substitution, as we mentioned before, are a subject that we just barely scratched the surface of. Remember, just like you can improvise with scales in individual notes, you can also improvise somewhat with chords. Certain chords will substitute for other chords, either by literally replacing them because they are chord synonyms. Remember, a C6 and an A minor 7 have exactly the same notes in them. If you look at them, it's just kind of a matter of which note, once again, as we've seen so many times before, it's just a matter of which note you consider to be the root note of the pattern. If you consider C to be the root note, then it's functioning as a C6. If you choose A to be the root note, then it's functioning as an A minor 7. There are literal substitutions, and there are also the matter of inserting other chords within a chord progression to flesh the chord progression out. These are still called substitutions. We just mentioned this stuff last time. Mentioned a couple of other facts about it. Chords with sharp 5s and flat 5s, chords with sharp 9s and flat 9s wind up being substitute chords a lot in jazz progressions and stuff like that. Diminished chords are used a lot. The secondary minor chords in any given key we wind up using a lot. So there is a lot more to both the subject of modulation and the subject of substitution. And I mentioned last week the Guitar Handbook, which I've always recommended as a good general book to look at. I'm still not sure you could actually learn to play the guitar from this book. I think you really need somebody to explain stuff to you. I'm not even sure that this is absolutely the current edition either. I've had this copy for at least 2 or 3 years now. It always looks something like this. It's a cover and it's got some guitars on it. You know what I mean? This book has been around for years. It's a fun book to read. You'll just enjoy reading it in general. There's biographies of influential players. There's like all facts about how your guitar works and electronics and stuff like that. And fascinating book. It's called The Guitar Handbook by Ralph Denyer. I highly recommend it. Okay, now what I'd like to do now is we go back just very quickly through the entire program here and just remind you particularly of the things you have to work on. This is a different program, isn't it, in terms of learning music. A lot of you have maybe taken some private lessons before where you've gone and you've worked with a teacher and you've done a lot of playing. One of the things we haven't done in here is a lot of playing, and I'm not suggesting that in this program you're not going to have other things to do and other you might want to take other lessons, and you're certainly got a lot more things to learn and that you can read about in other books. Hopefully we have given you enough of the basics of how music works so that when you go to read these books, which maybe you've tried to before, hopefully now they will make some sense to you. And you know, I tell the joke at this point now, I read music theory textbooks for fun because hopefully we've made the point that music is fun to learn about. It's not this big scary monstrosity like it's presented a lot of times. You really pretty much know it all. And the other thing I want to point out is you may have trouble believing that you know it all, but you'll start to see that. I think I've mentioned this before. When you do what I always say is don't just play songs. Don't just play songs. Try to look at them too. Try to analyze them. When I'm in a band, I write out my own handwritten chart for every song I play. One is so that I can have all the changes on one page instead of having to flip through a book where there's several pages. I mean, you're right in the middle of playing the song, and what, you're supposed to stop and flip pages? No, what I do is I write out a single or a double page chart and then look at the chords. See if you can look at the chord progression and, oh, okay, there's a C, there's an F and a G, there's an A minor. Oh, I get it. This is in the key of C. That's a 1, 4, 5, 6 progression in the key of C. And then you'll start to realize. I was telling Mike just a little while ago, in my private practice here as a music teacher yesterday, I figured out 4 rock and roll songs for various students of mine, and they all worked this way. There wasn't one exception that didn't work like this. Punk rock. One of these tunes was a punk rock. It was a band I hadn't heard of before, and I can't remember what it was right now. But, you know, everybody thinks punk rock is this big, modern, new, revolutionary thing. No, it isn't. I'm sorry to tell you, it works the same way that everything else works. I'll tell you, the difference between punk rock and Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star isn't worth mentioning. It's only attitude. In terms of the structures of the music, it's really just the same. And so you're reading through your progression here, but all of a sudden there's a D chord in here, and you want to scratch your head and go, hey, what's going on here? There shouldn't be a D major chord in the key of C. What's going on here? Ah, must be a modulation. The more you analyze the music that you play, and believe me, you can do it. Just whip your slide rule out and look at your modal stuff, you know what I mean? The more you analyze the songs you play, the more you're going to find out you pretty much know it all when you understand the content of this program here. But what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go back and learn all this stuff. Some of you in the later shows, you will notice that you became a little lost. You weren't quite sure what I was talking about. The reason that is happening is because you didn't actually memorize and learn the stuff in the previous lessons. One very important thing about this program is that what I like to think is I have figured out what order to tell people the stuff in. But if you didn't actually memorize that stuff along the way, then you could easily get beyond and start to become confused. So the beauty of the fact that you now own these tapes is that you can go back anytime you want and look at this stuff. And as we go through this review, I'm going to point out to you the very specific things that you have to make sure that you've got memorized, okay? So here we go. Let's take a general review of the whole program. Wow, when was the last time you saw this page? It was a long time ago, wasn't it? This was our very first lesson. And you know, like I say, we're just going to zip through this. This is the stuff that you've got to have memorized at this point. Our first word was satisfaction. The only way you're going to satisfy yourself as a musician is to be a real player. And what does a real player do? They play the whole song. They don't just play little riffs. And they check themselves out. Stop and ask yourself, gee, how did I do? How are you supposed to ask yourself how you did if you don't know what you're doing in the first place? Well, you do know what you're doing. Very simple. Music is a language. It's also a very simple language. It's only got 6 parts of speech. One of the first big things you got to make sure you've got memorized is your 6 main areas of music: pitch, rhythm, timbre, dynamics, technique, and notation. The reason being is that the most important part of this chart, remember, at the end of each song you play, you've got to answer yes to these 6 questions. Otherwise, you're only fooling yourself that you're playing music. Did I play the right notes? Did I keep with the beat? How did I sound? Did I control my volume properly? Was I holding the guitar the right way? And you know, was I able to read the charts and read the notation in order to be able to do it? Those are your 6 main areas of music. Remember this: pitch is the big one. This is the one that you have the most facts to learn about. Most of this program has been about pitch. We didn't really talk an awful lot about rhythm, did we? And as I mentioned before, there are some areas of music that we weren't able to cover 100% in this, and some people might actually be rather nervous that we didn't talk more about rhythm. We will be upgrading this program as we go over the next couple of years, so you're going to want to keep an eye on our website for future shows that we're going to do, and upgraded versions of the shows that we've done now. In a few minutes, I'm also going to read off a little list of things that I think, in the end, that I didn't cover 100%, that you're going to want to acquire from other sources, and possibly one of those things is rhythm. Mostly, I feel that when people are actually playing, people's rhythm is generally pretty good, particularly if you're working out with your timekeeper. My sense is the way you strum the guitar and the way you pick individual notes, a lot of that you're going to feel okay, and you know, you can review the stuff that we talked about under notation and rhythm, but timbre, not a lot to learn about. Dynamics, not a lot to learn about. Technique, one of the things that we didn't talk a lot about in this program was advanced types of techniques like tapping. Probably a lot of you know, since like the Eddie Van Halen era, there's all these fancy ways of articulating notes, for example, tapping and stuff like that. We didn't get into that. That's just beyond the scope of this program. But there are videos you can buy. There are books you can buy. What we did is we got you, hopefully, to understand the basic things about how the language works. But there's plenty more to learn specifically about playing the guitar, and I understand that. But pitch is the largest area of music. It's the one that you have the most facts to learn about. Remember, it's about high and low, but high and low what? Well, frequency, if you want to get all scientific about it. But remember, it's really about what notes you play. How many notes do we have? 12. And then we arrange these notes in different patterns, and these patterns are chords and scales and melody and harmony, intervals, progressions, arpeggios, modes. All these things that we've been talking about for the last few weeks has all been all about different pitch patterns. That's all we need to look at on this page here. We got the next page we've got here is we got to talk a little bit deeper about pitch, the frequency of the sound wave, which is controlled by the speed of the vibration of the string, which is controlled by how thick the string is, how tightly it's stretched, and then when you're actually fretting notes on your fretboard, you're moment by moment changing the length of the string. That's how we play different notes. How many notes do we have? 12, and that's your alphabet in the language of music, and you've got to make sure you've got your musical alphabet memorized. No sharps and flats between B and C and E and F, right? You got to know all that stuff. Okay, on to this next page, and this, if you ask me, this is the biggest page in the entire program. And I said that before when we were talking about this. This is what they're going to carve on my tombstone. If I can get people to understand this concept in music right now, I feel like I've done pretty good. Those of you who understand this at this point will find yourself light years ahead of your friends in terms of making progress as a player. It goes like this. It's about pitch again. What do we know about pitch so far? Well, we've got 12 notes, and that's kind of like your alphabet. And what we've spent so much time learning is how to form these 50 different patterns, which are very much like words in the language, spelled out of that 12-note alphabet. And just like any word in any language, these patterns exist in like 4 different dimensions, and you need to know something about them in each dimension. There are 4 ways to know each pitch pattern. The easiest way to remember this, and you have to memorize this, if there's one thing in this whole program you got to memorize, it's this. 4 ways to know your pitch patterns. You got to think them, you got to read them, you got to recognize them when you hear them, and finally, you've got to be able to make that noise yourself. You've finally got to be able to speak in the language. 4 ways to know each word. Every word in the English language, you know those 4 words, right? You can think them, you can read them when you see them on paper, you recognize them when you hear them, and finally, you can speak them yourself. In a musical context, it goes like this. To think means you know music, the concepts involved in music. This is the whole world, of course, of music theory. This is where you've got all these letters and numbers that you have to memorize and all that stuff. Now, the second thing is you've got to be able to read in the language. You've got to know at least something about musical notation and the three different styles. Tablature is easy. You can pick that up so easily. I'm not sure I covered that 100%, but you'll notice there's a key for reading tablature in your support material there too. And every issue of Guitar Player magazine, if you look in the index, you'll find that there's a page that shows you how all the different symbols for tablature work. There's also standard notation. Hopefully we demystified that a little bit for you too when we talked about notation. There's a good old-fashioned chord box too, and I'm sure all of you know how to read those at this point. But when we go to the third way to know your pitch patterns, this is the big one. This is the most important thing you've ever learned from me. Each of these patterns sounds like something. You have to learn to recognize. You know what all the words in the English language sound like, at least the ones you're familiar with. You've got to get to where you know what all of these 50 patterns actually sound like. And we're going to be doing, in the second part of today's show, we're going to give you a little taste of what ear training is all about. I believe that the only way to ear train really is to work with another human being who already has trained ears. Now, I'm not saying it's useless to look at the ear training stuff on the internet or useless for these home study courses that deal with ear training, but I don't see how they could ever be as good as another person quizzing you on these relationships by ear, and I'm going to show you how that works in a few minutes. Ear training, the two most important words you will ever hear anybody say on the subject of music. Nobody has more fun playing music than me, and part of it is because I write my own music and I think it's pretty good. I'm a good improviser. I can figure out any song just by listening to it a few times, and that's all the ear training stuff right there. So everybody goes, well, hey, let's start ear training right now. The one problem you got to realize is, how are you going to train your ears to recognize these patterns if you don't understand the theory behind them in the first place? So really, in the end, the whole reason we haven't talked about ear training yet is because this whole program has been about learning your theory. Now you are in a position where you can go back and learn what all of your different chords sound like, and what all your different scales sound like, and what all your different intervals sound like. And like I said, you may have to do that with another person. Hopefully, another thing, as I've said, this doesn't mean that you're not going to take some other music lessons in your life. And at least now, when you're on the phone and you're looking around for a teacher, one of your first big questions should be, do you stress ear training? Do you have a good ear training program? And some of you may exclusively go to a private teacher just to do ear training, and you'll see what that's about. Finally, number 4, you've got to be able to speak in the language. And this is where we say in music, that's the stuff that's all about the finger patterns that you're going to play, because when you speak in music, you use some kind of machine, to speak for you, and at least the instrument we're talking about playing, you have to know what to do with your fingers. So that's where the finger pattern stuff all comes in. A lot of you came in here thinking that this is all there was to learning to play a musical instrument, was to learn what to do more and more with your fingers. Well, hopefully we've dispensed with that. The next thing we learned about was how your guitar works. You know the musical alphabet. Here it is along the top up here. Here's the names of the 12 notes. Boy, you better have that memorized by now. You learned that E, A, D, G, B, E is the tuning of the guitar. Why? Well, because there's 4 notes. If you look at your musical alphabet, there's 4 notes in between each of those open strings. Why did they decide to tune the guitar so that there'd be 4 notes in between each string? Because you've got 4 fingers and an opposable thumb. What could be more logical? The guitar is a totally knowable instrument. Remember, they decided to tune these 2 strings, the G string and the B string, 1 note closer together. They're only 3 notes apart because, remember, there are profound physical limitations as to what combinations of notes you can play on a guitar. And somebody just figured out one day that if they made that one little compromise in the way the instrument was tuned, that a whole lot of, particularly in the area of chording, a whole lot of previously impossible finger patterns became possible, and they just decided to go with that. Now, so that left us with the notion that the cardinal rule of the guitar is that 4 fingers equals 4 frets. If you're in control with your 4 fingers on the neck of the guitar, you're pretty much in control of the entire instrument, and you can play right down on the first 4 frets of the guitar. You can play fully 2 and 1/3 octaves worth of notes across the range of your 6 strings. Remember, your 2 outside strings, your low E and your high E, are 2 octaves apart from one another. The middle octave is right here, the 2nd fret on your D string, if you look at your fretboard chart. And I should have pulled that out, but I don't have that handy. So 4 fingers equals 4 frets. If you're in control of those 4 frets, you're pretty much in control of the entire guitar. Another thing you've got to do is oh, there's a fretboard chart right there. You've got to memorize your frets. You've got to know that that's an A, and that's a D, and that's a C, and that's a G, all the way up and down the fretboard. A lot of people try to avoid learning that, but that will just be a crippling factor for you if you don't. Remember, you can use your understanding of how to finger different intervals to help you remember where the alphabet letter notes are up and down your fretboard. So that's another big thing you've got to memorize. You know, take your time. You don't have to do everything this week or this month or even this year. But if you want to be a functioning guitar player and satisfy yourself, this is the very stuff you've got to have memorized. The last thing we talked about the specifics of the instrument is further up the neck. You can't use the open string to play all 12 notes. And what we learned, what it really requires to control the guitar is the control of 5 frets. So further up the neck, since you can't use the open strings, 4 fingers equals 5 frets. So we had to learn how to do finger shifts. Remember this stuff where you have to reach out of your 4-finger range here. Going up the scale, we do what are called index shifts, and we do, your index finger plays 2 notes. When you're coming down the scale, you do what are called pinky shifts. Again, these are not hard and fast rules. I shouldn't have presented it like that. I should have said, you just use the most logical type of shift that you can in the particular playing situation that you're in. And most people would agree that when you're kind of going up through the scale, you're better off using index shifts, and when you're kind of in a descending way, you're most of the time better off. But again, these are not hard and fast rules. But at this point, you understand everything about the guitar. You know how to play the chromatic scale. Remember what that is? There's a lot of different types of scale. So the chromatic scale is when you play all 12 notes in a sequence, all separated by half steps, aren't they, right? Boy, you know, like I said, remember I've talked about my play dumb questions? You know, we've been through a half a dozen of them right there. You know, how many notes? Why is the guitar tuned the way it is? How do you, you're going to run into very few people in your entire life who know how to play a chromatic scale anywhere on the neck of the guitar, and you do. And I always say that if you know how to play a chromatic scale, that's it right there. That's pretty much the whole thing. If you can type the alphabet, you know, take the English language, for example. If you can type the alphabet, doesn't that pretty much mean that you can type any word as long as you know how it's spelled? Well, that's the first big skill, if you ask me, is to master the chromatic scale. Now, the next thing we looked at is the subject of chords. We learned facts like there's 45 to 50 different types of chords. There's 12 of any type. That's because there's 12 keys to play in. But, for example, if there's 12 different major chords, how come I only left room to write down 5 of them? Well, remember, owing to the physical limitations of the guitar, there are only these 5 basic finger forms: E form, A form, D form, C form, and G form. But if you understand the concept of bar chords over here, then not only can you play all 12 chords, but you can play 5, at least 5, and later on, you might recall we even showed you more ways, but at this point we discovered that there was 5 ways to play any chord. You need to learn all of the chords on this page. This is another big thing. I don't give weekly or lesson-wise little things that you have to learn, but over the next couple of years, you've got to trust me. You've got to learn every single shape on this page. You've got to learn how to play any of them that are applicable as bar chords, which is most of them in one way or another, as bar chords. You got to be able to get there in a split second, because the drummer is not going to wait for you to get your fingers into place to play these chords. And remember, you also have to know the names of all of these different chords too. 4 things: play it as a bar chord, get there instantly, and know the name of each chord you play by looking at where its root note is. Remember, all chords have roots. Every chord you play has its root note, and that was all that stuff. We talked about chord names, that there's 3 parts. The first part is the root note. The second part is the type of chord you're playing. And the third part, which isn't always given, is the actual form that you're playing in. So how would you play B flat major 7 in the A form? Well, you work backwards through the name of the chord, And you look at your A form, and then you look for the major 7, and then it's rooted on B flat, so you're going to have to move it up the neck a certain number of frets to actually play that chord. Then we talked about how to practice chords. Remember, using the drum machine. The sad truth about chords is that playing chords is the easy part. It's the switching with the beat that's the actual problem. So practice chords in pairs, back and forth every 4 beats for 5 minutes at a time with the drums, slow as you need. Think ahead. Make sure you listen to yourself. Don't be caught dead playing your guitar without your drum machine on. If you are not playing with a beat machine or a timekeeper of some sort, you are essentially wasting your time. Is there any playing situation where rhythm doesn't count? No, there isn't. So you should be using that concept to practice with too. If you haven't gotten yourself a drum machine yet, get out there and find one. They're all over the place. The keyboards, I think, are really the best ones because you get a little keyboard built into them and all that stuff. You know all about that. So that's how to practice. Now, one thing that I think I was kind of weak on is in this program is we didn't talk an awful lot about what goes on with your right hand. We mentioned things like when you're picking individual notes, you've got to make sure you get used to doing down and up strokes absolutely religiously. That's what's known as alternate picking. There are all kinds of modern ways of thinking about picking. You can pick these up in the trade magazines, Guitar Player magazine and stuff like that. I didn't take a lot of time to talk about that because I think that's the technique-oriented stuff is fairly easy information to come by on your own. So that's why I didn't stress that. But one thing we only talked about a little is how important it is to understand that same concept of the down and up religiously applies also to the way you strum chords. What you're going to find out is a lot of you are not going to get this right at first. You're going to be stopping and starting and going faster and faster with your hands, but that's not really the way strumming generally works. Your hand is your clock, and you're going to find out most strumming patterns work with your hand just going back and forth like the pendulum of a clock. The thing is, you don't hit the strings with every stroke. So we get these strumming patterns like down, miss, up, down, up is one of the most common and basic strumming patterns. But every song that you look at, you kind of have to investigate the way the chord is strummed. And many of you are going to strum badly for a while. I know I did. I probably strummed the wrong way for the first 5-6 years I played the guitar. But again, I think it's over time, I think I just settled into that realization that it was always going to be with my hand going back and forth at a regular rate. This is the simplest and most common strumming patterns. I don't even remember, I haven't looked at that tape lately, whether I showed you any other ones than that. But again, there's some of this stuff is in the guitar handbook too, and a lot of different sources where you can pick up information about strumming and right hand technique and stuff. Mostly that, I think a lot of us just have to learn that by experience in playing. And another thing I wanted to mention is you don't become simply a guitar player by acquiring more information. That's what we've done in this program, but that's not all. You have a whole nother life as an actual player. You've got to practice every day. You've got to get out there and jam with your friends. It's never, in a way, it's never too early to join your first garage band. You have to be a little bit fearless. You can't be shy. You got to put yourself out there and play with other humans. Music is a wonderful, wonderful way to interact with other people and stuff. It's been so cool in my life, all the friends I've made through music and stuff like that. But you can't be shy about it. You got to get out there and do it. And there are all other sorts of resources around for playing. Go see as much music as you can. You know what I mean? Go to concerts. If you're old enough and you can go out to the clubs, go check out the local clubs where the live musicians play. You can learn so much about the guitar by just watching other people play. A lot of clubs have open mic nights where you can go and meet other players who maybe aren't the real professional players, but they're like you. They're the student level players, and you can form relationships and start to get involved with other people and jamming with other people and getting in bands and stuff like that. That's where you're going to acquire your actual physical playing skills and stuff like that. I mean, in the end, what it is not to just sit there and think about music. It's to actually physically play. So you got to practice every day, and you got to find a way to have some kind of playing outlet for yourself too. Otherwise, you probably won't stay interested. This subject, now to continue our review, huge subject in music, how the musical number system works. This is the key to understanding music theory right here. And if you understand the musical number system, you will start to understand how your slide rule works. And this is the coolest tool you're ever going to find right here. As it exists now in the package of support material, you're going to have to assemble this yourself with an X-Acto knife and cut it out and paste it together there. You'll see that there are directions in there for how to do that. But you're going to want to do that. Some of my students I see, they go on for months without putting their slide rule together. That's not going to help you much. This will tell you how to spell every single one of your 50 patterns and also all your modal relationships. They're all right on your slide rule here. And the key to understanding that is understanding the musical number system. Remember, these 50 patterns work the same way no matter which of the 12 keys that you play in. So wouldn't it be nice if we had an alternative naming system for naming the notes, alternative to the alphabet system, that is, that names the notes like there's only one key to play in, one universal key. Well, that's what the number system does. The number system treats music like there's only one key to play in, making it 11 times easier to memorize your 50 pitch patterns. A major chord, after all, is 1, 3, 5, no matter what key you play it in. And then you can look up specifically in the slide rule, till you have this stuff memorized, you can specifically look up in the slide rule what those spellings are. The musical number system is based on the major diatonic scale, which any other scale, like any other scale, is a particular sequence of intervals. It goes whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Or in other words, mostly whole steps except between the 3rd and 4th note and the 7th and 8th note. And that's how the musical number system works. All the other notes in between are either sharped and flatted, like 1 and 2 are a whole step apart, aren't they? There's a note in between. What do we call that note? Well, sometimes you call it sharp 1. Sometimes you call it flat 2. Note numbers like 9, 10, 11, 13, these are just up, the way you want to think of it at this juncture anyway, is they're just sort of like up in the next octave. 8, after all, is the same as 1. 9 is the same as 2, and it's a whole step above 8. 10 and 11 are only a half step apart. Why? Because they're the same as 3 and 4, and you'll remember that 3 and 4 are only a half step apart. Make sure you got your musical number system down. It's the key to understanding all of music theory. Then we did this caveman stuff. Some people were going, what the heck is this? But remember, the 3 most important notes and intervals, the relationships between the notes, the 3 most important notes that out of which human beings created the 12-note system, still the core of everything we do today. As you've gone through this program, have you seen how many times the numbers 1 and 5, how important the intervals of a perfect 5th, a perfect 4th, and a perfect octave are? They're everything in music, and it comes right from that note right there. And isn't it interesting to know that those were also the first pitch relationships that humans ever discovered through the harmonics, most likely on the strings of their bows and arrows, in a way. You all know about harmonics as guitar players, but it's a very profound thing. It led to our discovery of the whole 12-note system. Now, this was the last subject that we dealt with in part 1, the whole subject of notation. Remember, the 6th main area of music is the whole subject of notation. On some level, you need to understand how written music works. I'm not saying if you're just interested in rock and roll, you don't necessarily have to become a great sight reader in music, but you do have to have a pretty good grasp of that. We talked about the vertical axis, which is all the pitch stuff, and then we talked about something about rhythm. As I was confessing before, I think we didn't stress rhythm quite enough in this program, and keep an eye on future website information about, we may do an expanded a library on stuff about rhythm too, and how it's all written out is all this notation stuff. Now, that was the end of part 1 of our program. You learned all the basic things about how music works in part 1 there, and then we graduated on to part 2. I couldn't put all of these up on the podium at the same time, so let's load up part 2. In part 2 of the program here, we began to learn all of our 50 different pitch patterns that we have to learn. This is what I call the 6 levels of pitch theory. We started off, and they're in order of complexity, aren't they? We started off with the simplest ones and worked our way up. What was the simplest one? Silence. Where would music be without silence? Just a cool thing to keep in the back of your mind. Then we graduated to the next most complex patterns. Patterns that involve one note. Well, no songs just have one note in them, but somewhere in every conventional piece of music you play is one note that's acting as the nucleus note. And in a sense, all the other notes in the song are kind of whirling around that note like the electrons whirling around the nucleus of the atom, or like the planets orbiting the sun in our solar system. This is such an important concept that we know this by a bunch of different names. Whenever you're talking about what key you're in, root note, do, note number 1, these are all different ways of identifying this nucleus note. The tonic note, the fundamental, the whole concept of resolution. After that, we went on to level number 3, which is where things really started to get intense. Intervals. The interrelationship, the distance, the pitch relationship between any two notes. Intervals. We said there's 6 things you have to do. Name it, define it, give examples and formulas, be able to read it, be able to play it, and be able to hear it. So we did this whole thing on intervals here. Remember, there's 13 different intervals that basically you have to understand. The smallest one is the unison, which is a distance of 0, and the largest one is the octave itself. There are larger intervals than that called compound intervals, but they're generally just thought of as simple intervals that have been expanded. There are a lot of different distinctions between different types of intervals. Major intervals, minor intervals, augmented, diminished, perfect intervals, all this stuff. If you don't have that stuff memorized, you got to go back. This is one of the critical subjects in music. Intervals is the biggest word in music theory, so make sure you go back and review that tape if you don't have all this stuff memorized. Every interval has its inside-out mirror image, known as its inverted intervals, and you've got to memorize all those different relationships too. Eventually, you've got to ear train all these intervals. I know what every single one of these intervals sound like. I can play any note on the piano and instantly sing any one of these intervals relative to that note that I'm playing. That's how I can improvise. That's how I can compose. The next big subject, level number 4 of our 6 levels of pitch theory, is the subject of scales. Now that we know what intervals are, we string a whole bunch of intervals together, mostly seconds, whole steps and half steps, major seconds, minor seconds, to form scales. We have the same 6 things to do. Name it, define it, give examples and formulas, play it, read it, hear it. Here's our must-know list of scales. These are not the only scales that we talked about. This list here of the 14 must-know scales, remember, you use them every day if you really understand what's going on in music. When you're playing a song, a best way to think about it is there is a separate scale for each chord in the song. The average pop rock song has 3, 4, 5, 6 different chords in it. So there's a different scale for each one of these chords. So it's not going to take you too long to bump into these. This is another huge page. You have got to memorize all this stuff. What is the numeric spelling for the Aeolian mode? Do you know? Boy, that's such a huge scale. The Aeolian mode, the natural minor scale. I know it. 1, 2, flat. I better say it first and then sing it. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. Sounds like this if I play this note right here. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. I know what all of these scales sound like. I've ear trained this. I wasn't able to ear train them until I understood the theory behind them. So you've got to make sure you've got all of your, at least your must-know scales down. Now, these aren't the only scales that there are. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is another huge page here, this whole thing about diatonic harmony. I'm not even going to take any time to review this stuff other than to point out this is the weird world of modes where we learned that the same set of notes is several different scales, and that explains why you keep seeing the same chord progressions over and over again, like this G, C, D, E minor, A minor. Why? Those are all the keys that can be made out of the notes that are in a G major scale and its various modes. We talked about this for hours. If you didn't get that, like I say, you own these tapes now. Go home, look them over, look them over. You're also going to see we're going to have, I don't know how soon we'll get this set up, but we are going to have a way that you can email us or fax us questions, and we're going to try the best we can to on a very personal level, solve any confusion you have about any of these programs. But this is a huge subject, so big I can't even take time because I got to get on and talk about the ear training stuff today too. You've got your mode jam tape and you've got your color-coded finger charts, with which you, if you go back and look at that tape on, we did a whole hour on how to use that mode jam tape. That's how you learn how to improvise, by training yourself to know all these finger patterns for all the different scales. And you're also, when you're playing with your Moog jam tape, you're also doing a certain amount of ear training. You want to be listening to how each note you play relates to each chord that you play. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the scales on your must-know list are not the only scales that are out there. And the system of modes associated with diatonic music is not the only system of modes that there are. Pentatonic scales have modes. And an interesting thing to remember is the minor pentatonic scale is actually the sixth mode of the major pentatonic scale. On our must-know list, we only have two pentatonic scales, the major pentatonic and the minor pentatonic. Remember, they're modes of each other. Not only that, there's other modes of a pentatonic scale as well. We also mentioned that the melodic minor scale has a system of modes associated with it. These are the scales: Dorian flat 9, Lydian sharp 5, Lydian flat 7, Mixolydian flat 13, Locrian natural 9, and the altered scale. These are the modes of melodic minor, and as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, these scales are not going to show up necessarily in textbook diatonic music, but they are going to begin to show up in chord progressions where modulations are involved. And so when you're graduating beyond basic diatonic harmony into modulating chord progressions, that's when these scales become important. You've got finger charts for all of these. Make sure you're looking at those too. We also talked about music that's in minor keys where 6 becomes 1. And a simple concept. We talked about that if you use the harmonic minor scale, you get a 5 chord that's a major chord instead of a minor chord. I'm really zipping now, aren't I? But that's okay. You got these tapes you can look back at. We talked about blues music, where the funny things that happen in blues, these blue notes, flatted thirds over major chords, a heavy use of flatted 7s, and other blue notes. We had Danny Lawson come in, and you've got that great tape with all those little blues cliches and finger tricks and bends and hammer-ons that blues players use all the time. You could do a whole series on the blues. There are videotapes and books out there. A lot of you are heavy into blues type music, and again, we didn't spend probably as much time as some of you would have liked, but if we got you the basic gist, we were doing pretty good. We also talked about modal music, where sometimes neither the 1 chord or the 6 chord is the home chord. Sometimes the 2 chord is the home chord, and that's a Dorian harmonization. Sometimes the 5 chord is, and that's a Mixolydian harmonization. Then, level 5, the whole subject of chords. First, we learned about triads, which are the basic building blocks, and there's equal interval triads and unequal interval triads. 4 different types. Make sure you've got the structure of your 4 different triads all memorized. Then we learned that what mostly happens with chords is you take a triad and add notes to it. Like a C6 chord is a major triad, 1, 3, 5, with note number 6 added to it. Of course, just when you get that down, you find out that there's a little more to it than that. There's some weird, I'm sure some of you have been confused about this for years. There are some weird exceptions and surprises in the way chords work. For example, C7 doesn't go 1, 3, 5, 7. You have to remember that that's actually a chord called a dominant 7, and it actually has a flat 7 in it. And we have some other exceptions here that you've got to memorize these. Once you do, however, I think they're in here. I think I saw it in here. You will be able to look, and you've got a sheet that looks very much like this in your support material, which has the formula on it for every single one of the chords that you're going to encounter in popular music, all represented by patterns of numbers. And, you know, all your triads are here, and your dominant 7s, and here's the number patterns for all of them like that. You should be able to look at the name of any chord and figure out what notes are actually in it. Once you know the formula for a chord, that's just the beginning, and there's all different ways of manipulating these formulas: chord voicings, inversions, open voicings, closed voicings, slash chords. We found that even within our 5 different finger shapes, there are all these little sub-shapes of various different inversions, and we see our different forms, A form and how it relates to G form. Over here we even have, and again, in your support material, you have a page that looks very much like this. These are various little open tunings that can be coaxed out of the guitar. So there aren't just 5 ways to play any chord. Within each of those 5 forms are other little smaller shapes and that are very cool to know about. We also talked about 4-part harmony. I view that as just the last thing that you have to understand about how chords formulas are manipulated, and this has a lot more to do with monophonic instruments, and I'm not even going to take time to review that. Fascinating subject, which many of you were confused about when you took music theory courses. Finally, level 6, our last subject of the 6 levels of pitch theory, chord progressions. We already learned mostly about chord progressions during the subject of scales and modes, because as we see, mostly chord progressions evolve out of harmonization of scales and looking at the various modes that come out of these different scales. Major diatonic chord progressions, natural minor chord progressions, harmonic minor chord progressions, Dorian progressions, Mixolydian progressions, blues type progressions, and all of that stuff. So make sure you go back and review that. And finally, beyond that, our last subject that we covered is sometimes the music doesn't stay in one key. You do what are called modulations and change into different keys using pivot chords that have significant relationships to more than one key. Again, the Guitar Handbook or any good music theory book will tell you everything you need to know about modulation and about substitution. And there you have it, my friends. You know pretty much everything there is to know about popular music. Believe it or not. Keep analyzing your songs and you'll find out that it's true. Now, got about 10 minutes left here, and what I want to, interestingly enough, what I want to suggest to you is, in all these 32 hours we've spent together at this point, we have not done any of the important stuff yet. All we've done is gotten our heads going. We need to get our ears going too. You need to know what ear training is all about, and I'm just going to give you a taste of what that's about. Remember, ear training is all about singing, because I believe that the only proof that your ear training coach will ever have that you know what this stuff sounds like is your ability to sing it. A lot of people don't want to believe that. They want to believe that their inability to sing involves vocal control issues, which for some people maybe it does, but that's only a tiny little percentage of it. My motto is, if you can't hum it, if you can't sing it, you don't hear it, and you better face that fact right now. So the first thing I have my students do in ear training is I just play a note for them, and I ask them if they can hum it, like this. Now I'm singing that note, aren't I? I'm going to go to another one. And most people can do that. It's only a small percentage of people that have any trouble doing that at all. Sometimes I have to work a little bit with people on that. I'll give you an example. I just started the other day with a guy named Frank, who's been taking lessons from me for about 3 weeks now, and started to introduce the concept of ear training to him. He was terrified. He's going, I'm pitch deaf. He was calling it tone deaf. Remember, we talked about that. He's going, I'm pitch deaf. He's laughing. I'm going, ever since I was a kid. I said, hey, you know what? If you're pitch deaf, you have no future playing the guitar. You might as well just leave now. And he was like, huh? And I go, and not only that, I'll prove to you you're not pitch deaf. Can you hum this note? And Frank didn't exactly nail it the first time. It was kind of like, and I went, that's too high, Frank. And he went, and he found it because it's in there. And I said, all your life you've been worried that you're pitch deaf, and you're not. You know what I mean? And a lot of you have the same thing. You think you're pitch deaf or you think you're tone deaf, and you're not. Remember, the percentage of people that are is only a tiny little bit. Now, the next thing I do with people in ear training is a big jump above that. Once you can sing individual notes, I feel the next thing you need to be able to do, and this is a big jump, and you're going to need help with this. You're going to need a coach. You, by ear, need to tell when you listen to a chord. You need to be able to hear where its root note is. So the next thing I start to do is work with people, and I play chords for them like this. And then I ask them to sing me where the root note of that chord is. Now you at home, can you listen to this for a second? Do you have any idea? Where's the root note? And the only way you're going to prove to me that you know where the root note of that chord is you're going to have to sing it for me. I'll sing it for you. Ready? Here it is. Do. Wouldn't you agree that that was the root note of that chord? That was that central nucleus note that the whole thing was working off? Here's another chord. Where's the root note of that chord? Do. Now, those were both major chords. Here's a minor chord. Sad-sounding minor chord. Where's the root note of that? Do. Now, once people begin to get down where the various root notes of their chords are, we begin to experiment first with intervals, with all the other important relationships that work off of that root note. So here was our last chord. It was an A minor. And I go, okay, where's the root note of that chord? And they go, do. Actually, I'm not sure we need to look at the keyboard so much as we need to look at me. They've sung the root note of this chord, do. We begin to investigate the other relationships relative to that root note. For example, if you're hearing this as the root note, do, my first question to them might be, where's the note that's an octave higher than that? An octave is a huge concept in music. Do you know what one sounds like? Here it is. Here's the root note, do. Here's the note that's an octave above that, do. And so you hear me calling out numbers to my students. I'm going, where's 1? 1. Where's 8? 8, because remember, 8 is the octave note, isn't it? Then what's the next most important note? You know, don't you? How about the 5? 5. And then you got your old 2001 thing. 1, 5, 8. Now let me go to a major chord here. There's A major, because after 1, 5, 8, now I'll go to a different chord with these people. Where's 1? 1. Where's 5? 5. Where's 8? 8. Now, it typically takes the average person to get to that point. It might take them 4 lessons. It might take them 4 weeks. It might take them 4 hours to get to the point where they're getting a pretty high percentage of hearing their root notes and then gradually working into hearing the different relationships, first octaves and fifths. Everybody is different in this and takes a different rate. I've had some students that do this all in the first night because they've had more experience. I have other people that are kind of slow that it might take a couple of months before they're really hearing their octaves and their root notes and their fifths and stuff. But after we do that, after we've got our basic 1, 5, 8, 1, 5, 8, we start first then looking at the other notes. Now, the next most important note is probably the 3rd, right? Because that's going to start to turn these into major and minor patterns, like particularly chords. So here's 1. So I ask them, where's the 3? 3, 1, 3, 1, 3. Where's the 5? 5. Where's the 8? 8. 1, 3, 5, 8. What have you just sung? You just sung an arpeggiation of a major triad, of a major chord, 1, 3, 5, 8. You've just proven to your ear training coach that you know what a major chord sounds like. Here's a minor chord, sad sounding. It has the flatted 3rd. So where's the flat 3? 1, flat 3, 5, 8. And I have to work with people sometimes for hours to get to where they can consistently do this. Ear training does not happen overnight, but you gotta do it. It's the most important thing you'll ever do in your music career. You don't play the guitar with your fingers, you play it with your ears. That's the whole thing. Now, after that, those are the easy ones. That's the bad news. Then you've got to get all the rest of the notes in the chromatic scale, the ones that don't necessarily sound so good, like 2, 4, 6, 7, and those are the notes that are other notes that are just in the major scale. So then you hear me going with them like, okay, where's 1? 1. Where's 3? 3. Where's 5? 5. Where's the octave? 8. Now go back to 1. 1. Now where's 2? What does re sound like? Do, re. What does 2 sound like? 1, 2. Now that's not such a great sounding note, is it? 2. How about 4? 4, 6. And you know all these different relationships. How about the flat 7? Flat 7. Such an important note in blues music and stuff like that. You've got to get to the point where I can call out. In my program, I can call out any note in a chromatic scale. I'll be playing a chord, and I can call out any note in the chromatic scale, and you can sing that note for me against that chord. People go, oh my God. I go, all real musicians can do that. If you haven't faced it yet in your career, you got to face it now and find somebody to help you with your ear training. Now, there are other facets of ear training too. Later on, once I've got them with all their notes and their intervals down, then we start to listen to various patterns. If you know what all your notes sound like, you ought to be able to string them together to make the more complex patterns, like arpeggiations of chords, or indeed scales, like here's 1, 5, 8. Right here. What if I ask somebody, how does the Mixolydian mode go? Such an important scale, isn't it? It goes like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8, 8, flat 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's a major scale, except that it's got a flatted 7 in it. But what does it sound like? It doesn't really do you all that much good to just have all these letters and numbers memorized. You've got to memorize what those patterns sound like. Later on, we start looking at different chords. What kind of a chord is this? Oh, it sounds sad, therefore it must be a minor chord. That's right. What kind of a chord is this? Oh, it sounds happy, must be a major chord. That's right. What kind of a chord is this? Oh, it kind of sounds like fear, like fright. Oh, that must be a diminished chord. Right, that's right. You've got 45 different types of chords that you want to learn the sounds of over time. Now, not to be that's to be a jazz player. You got about 20 different chords you need to know about in order to be a rock player, but that's it. So, we start ear training with individual notes. We move on to being able to hear the roots of chords. We go on to being able to hear 1, 5, 8. We then add our thirds. We then add all the notes that are in the rest of the notes that are in a major scale. Then we add our chromatic notes: flat 2, flat 5, flat 6, and flat 7. And then we start actually ear training the various patterns, all of your scales, all of your chords. People go, really? All musicians do that? I had a guy the other day say to me, I don't have enough brain power to think like that. I go, well, give it up as a musician right now. Come on, let's go. It's it's not rocket science here. It's just music, for God's sakes. You just got to put a little work into it if you want the benefits. And there you go. That's about all the time. That's about all you need to know. I swear it really is. And the more you analyze your songs, the more you're going to find out that that's true. Now, in the last minute here, this is just absolutely incredible. I wanted to just wrap this all up and thank you all very much for supporting this program. And I wanted to thank on the air here all the wonderful people that have helped me put this together, donated so much of their time and resources to this. And I just can't thank them enough. But I just wanted to mention them all on the air, too. First off, right off the bat, Susie Reed, our director. Hasn't she done an amazing job keeping up with my crazy stuff up here and zigzagging back and forth and winging it the way I do? She's done just great. And also Terry Duenas, the director here. Susie and Terry and I go back like 15 years or so in public access television up here on the Cape, and we've worked on so many cool projects together, and I really appreciate all they've done for me in this show here. All the other folks here at C3 TV too, Edna out front at the desk, and Ralph and Rosie, and Dave DeWeese, and Eileen and Amy that have helped so much put this program together. The crew we've got here, they've finally solidified into this wonderful crew in about the second half of the program. Mike Moore in the control room, and Maria Monk, and Kathy Nyer, and running the cameras out here. Some of our past people that helped on previous shows: Joe Martin, Hal Q, Big Lee Davis, Matt Fulp, Jim Stathopoulos, Jim O'Hara. These were people who came and couldn't quite keep going with the whole second part of the program, but we appreciate all the time that anyone gave us. I also wanted to thank Bill Block and Dick McCarthy, who are two. Bill Block's an old friend of mine, and I wanted to kind of thank them for giving me the whole idea to do this show over time, and kind of plant the ideas for the whole thing. I wanted to thank all the guys at Charlie's Music too, Chip and Cindy and Keith and Paul and Eric and Randy. That's where I teach. That's where my private teaching thing is, at Charlie's Music in Hyannis, Massachusetts, up here on the Cape, and all the help that they've been to me over the years. Dan Lawson for coming and doing that awesome show on all the blues stuff. Just like I say, if you're up in Vermont this winter, go check out Danny wherever he's playing up there at the ski lodges up there. I wanted to thank some of my old music teachers too, because I wouldn't be here, particularly Dan May, wherever he might be. I've kind of lost touch with Dan. Last I heard, he was out in California. And Richard Brookins, who I just recently came across on the internet and hadn't seen in like 9-10 years or something like that. Dave Tegelar, who was a guitar teacher I had up here on the Cape several years ago, who helped me an awful lot. Also, I wanted to thank my parents, my mom and dad. My mom passed away about a month ago now, and I want to dedicate this whole series to her. She really is the one who gave me my start in music. She was a violinist, a symphony violinist, and started me on my first piano lessons and all that stuff when I was just a kid. Can't thank her enough. Well, anyway, like I said, we're going to put up this, we're going to try to get a thing in place where if you have any questions, you can contact us. Keep an eye. You'll see at the end of each show is our 800 number and our website where you can contact us, our email address. Stay in touch. Keep looking the tapes over and over again, and you'll do just fine because you pretty much know it all. You just got to get more playing experience, and that's the one thing we might not have done enough of. Okay? Well, it's been a blast, you guys, and enjoy it out there in TV land, and we'll see you again. For now, I'm Scotty West, and thanks for watching Absolutely Understand Guitar. Bye-bye.